I'm John Clark, and I'm a long-time organiser with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, um, and I'm I'm presently the Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University in Toronto. Um, for a long time, I've been involved in the debate on basic income. I've been on that side of the debate, on the left and within the anti-poverty movement, um, that is opposed to the idea, and I've opposed it on the basis that that in my view it would not deliver in terms of its promises to reduce poverty and create a more equal society. Um, and I also think that it would, if implemented further, rather than impede, an agenda of exploitation and austerity and privatization. Um, so I'm going to set out the case against it, and in doing this, I want to really stress the importance of considering the underlying factors within society that we have to look at. You can't assess, in my view, whether basic income would work or how it would work if you don't understand some of the basic considerations about the kind of society that we live in, and if you haven't considered what might limit systems of social provision. So I'm going to break it down into really three parts. In the first part, I'm going to look at the role that economic coercion plays in this society, and why there is a need for there to be economic coercion within a capitalist society. Then I'm going to take a look at income support systems in general, how systems of social benefits arose, what shapes them, what limits them, what can make them more adequate or less adequate. I'm going to go into all of those questions. And then finally, I'll take a look at basic income itself, and I'll critically consider the idea. And what I'll also do is try to propose some alternative directions that I think we should be moving in. So first, to deal with the capitalist job market and the question of economic coercion, and this is not an abstract question. This, I think, has a real bearing on the consideration of any social policy in general and basic income in particular. Most people in this society are or seek to be waged workers. They look for work in the capitalist job market. If they're successful, they find a job. In that job, they perform labor, and that labor creates the value, part of which is returned to them in the form of their wages, and part of it goes in the capitalist's pocket as profits. So this is fundamentally an exploitative society, and there have been earlier systems that were class-based and exploitative as well, but capitalism has some particular features about it that have a bearing on what we're talking about. First of all, it is a system that is based on the production and the buying and selling of commodities, and that includes the job market itself. Workers enter the job market and they attempt to sell their very ability to work, what Marx called their labor power. And capitalists, of course, buy the same. Now, this forces workers to compete for jobs. Capitalism is generally a very competitive system. Capitalists compete amongst themselves, but workers too have to compete within the job market. And this changes the dynamics very, very considerably. If you look at the old feudal system of production, you would have a feudal lord who demanded of the peasant population a tribute, a portion of that which they produced. But the peasant community would organize to provide that tribute along lines that were suitable to them. That meant that older and younger people whose health was maybe compromised, or people that had physical impairments of one kind or another, could all participate in one way or another within that process. But under capitalism, the capitalist actually hires the individual worker. And as a buyer of a commodity, the capitalist looks over the goods, uh, which means that he looks for um, workers who are likely to be very productive, looks for job-ready workers, and the concept of the able-bodied worker, counterposed to the concept of the disabled person, is produced under capitalism. So workers enter this competition with various relative advantages and disadvantages within the job market. What's also true is that the capitalists work to create and preserve, and sometimes intensify, a buyer's market, which is to say they like the situation where there are more workers looking for work than there are jobs available. So you have a competitive job market, and it very much rests on economic coercion. Um, Capitalism, much more than earlier systems, depends on economic coercion rather than physical coercion. That's not to say that the capitalist state can't be physically coercive, it certainly can. But primarily, the worker seeks work and remains at work because of the force of economic coercion. You know, if you were a slave, you weren't allowed to go anywhere and you couldn't refuse. The same for a feudal peasant. You'd be tied to the lord and the land by law and by custom. You couldn't just take off. That's not true under capitalism. Workers can leave, sometimes do, often do. But what holds workers in place is that power of economic coercion. And if that is to be created, and if it is to be maintained, the absolutely essential question is that workers must not have a viable alternative. They cannot have another major readily available source of income or means of surviving outside of that. That's essential to the creation and the preservation of the capitalist system. In order to create capitalism, they drove the feudal peasants off of the land. And that was absolutely essential. Had those people retained that land, they would not have been able to create a modern workforce as we understand it today. And that power of economic coercion remains an absolute necessity. I mean, to put it obviously, fast food workers who win the lottery don't usually stay on the job. That is the absolute prerequisite for this system. Now, if you have unfettered capitalism, unrestrained capitalism, then there are literally no alternatives for the overwhelming majority of people outside of possibly trying to steal for a living, and they're quite hard on that. So that means that in a pure form of capitalism, to misuse that word, young, old, sick, disabled, everyone has to scramble for what jobs are available. And even those who fail, even those for whom the effort is futile, from the standpoint of the capitalist, play a useful purpose, because they are contributing to the climate of desperation that can intensify exploitation, intimidate workers who have jobs, cut across efforts to organize to win better wages and working conditions, etc. But such a system of absolutely unrestrained and brutal exploitation and social abandonment can become problematic. First of all, it can compromise health on an enormous scale, so that the reproduction of a healthy, job-ready workforce is actually compromised. And secondly, it can lead to massive levels of social unrest, which may ultimately take the form of organized movements and even rebellions. So they're absolutely, they're very interested in restraining that. And so the capitalist state, in some ways, rescuing the capitalists from their own worst instincts, steps in to ensure that a modicum of social provision is there. And that is the basis for income support systems. Now, the general rule with regards to income support systems is that they will provide as much as necessary, but as little as possible. And there are two factors working from opposite sides in that regard. The first is the needs of capital, the need to maximize profitability and remove barriers to exploitation. So on that side, there is an interest in keeping things as low and inadequate as possible. And indeed, with changes in the capitalist economy, that need may intensify. If profits are squeezed, for example, there'll be a need to intensify exploitation and reduce social provision to an absolute minimum lower than before. On the other side, there's the question of the balance of forces within society. How powerful is the working class? How resistant are poor and unemployed people? If the capitalists face significant challenge in that direction, they may be forced, or their state may be forced, to provide more than they would otherwise intend to do. And I think a look at the historical record, which I'll just skim over here, does really confirm that. If you go back to the classic emerging capitalist economy situation of England, take the 1500s, you have a situation where the Tudor authorities of the day are presiding over the dispossession of peasantry, the creation of a modern workforce, and they use physical coercion, but it doesn't prove to be enough. People are rebelling, and people are dispossessed from their land. They're desperate and they're angry, and containing that social unrest becomes necessary. And so they introduce, under the reign of Elizabeth I, they introduce a poor law system. And it's a reluctant concession, a very minimal concession, but it's a concession. They agree that they will provide to meet people's needs under something called the poor laws, or the poor law, where that it will provide, but the idea is that in order to receive it, you must go into the workhouse, a dreadful place, a calculatedly dreadful place, in order to receive that support. And so you have this concession made, but then what happens is that working class people rebel against that limitation, and they demand, and for 2.5 centuries there's a veritable class war on the question, people demand, instead of indoor relief, that is to say incarceration in the workhouse, that they can receive outdoor relief, that they be provided with the things they need without being put in the workhouse. So you have working class resistance achieving levels of support that weren't originally intended by the authorities. Then in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution is gathering momentum, and the need for a disciplined and submissive workforce that will submit to the dreadful conditions of those factories, the dark satanic mills, will accept those conditions. The need to intensify that job readiness by removing alternatives becomes greater. And so an English Poor Law Reform Commission comes up with a proposal which is put into effect to essentially double down on the workhouse system. And that is put into effect, and it is implemented to a significant degree. There's still resistance, but to a significant degree, the workhouse system is intensified. The 1930s come along. You have the Great Depression. You have mass unemployment, huge suffering taking place in a context where there isn't any adequate social infrastructure to deal with it. And what emerges is a powerful, ubiquitous resistance from amongst the unemployed in a number of countries. And this forces concessions. It forces the authorities to provide more than they ever intended. The Second World War is followed by an upsurge of trade union organizing in many countries. And this creates a change in the balance of class forces within society that leads to unions being recognized, workers' living standards increasing, social programs being created and improved. Um, and throughout the next decade and a half, you see a situation um, where the working class living standards increase and gains are really made because of that resistance. Then it comes to an end. The post-war boom, the economic boom that followed the Second World War comes to an end. The increases in living standards that working class people have won at work and in the form of the social infrastructure are cutting into the profits of the capitalists. Profits are falling, and there is a need for a counter-offensive by capital. What emerges in the 1970s is an agenda that has become known as neoliberalism, and it has various elements to it, but they reorganize the workforce. They increase levels of exploitation, and absolutely central to this is the gutting of systems of income support. Um, they go about with that with great determination. They reduce the adequacy of programs, and they also reduce eligibility on many, many fronts. So that, for example, in Ontario in the 1990s, the system of benefits for single parents that had existed since the 1920s was abolished outright, and those single parents forced to scramble for jobs. For injured workers and for disabled people, similar processes have taken place whereby they have uh, reduced adequacy of benefits and eligibility criteria have been tightened up. Perhaps the ultimate example is the work capability assessment that was intensified in the UK after 2010, um, under which disabled people were assessed as to their ability to work, leading to situations where people with terminal illnesses were being declared ready, fit for work. Um, so that effort to intensify the above mentioned scramble for jobs has been carried out brutally, and it has an enormous effect. The growth of low wage precarious work and globally the reordering of the workforce and the creation of the global supply chain, these things have all been these things have all been won as part of a ruling class counter offensive. And our movements, our unions, our social movements, while defensive struggles have been taken up, have been weakened, have not been able to stop that agenda, not been able to drive it back. That's the reality of the situation. Recently, another startling application of this general principle of things being as adequate as they have to be, but as inadequate as possible, is seen with the pandemic. Suddenly, take the example of Canada, you see a situation where suddenly governments have to lock people down, which means closing down big sections of the economy. Uh, this creates a drying up of business revenue, but it also creates a situation where people suddenly have no income whatsoever on a scale that's unimaginable, that's unprecedented. And so governments step in temporarily with relatively adequate systems of social provision. CERB is introduced here in Canada, but immediately, and especially as economic pickup starts to take effect, you get this outcry from large sections of the media and the political establishment that this program is outrageously generous, it's creating idleness, workers won't go back to work, this is awful. And you start to see the erosion immediately, the rapid erosion of this temporary system. The CERB is replaced by the CRB, which is then subject to cuts. So this degrading of income, the income support that has taken place since the 1970s, has to be understood. as something that actually emerges from the needs of capital and the relative weakness of the working class side in terms of resisting and in terms of fighting back. So having said those things, I think that opens up the discussion to basic income, and anybody who's at all astute will get some idea of how I'm going to approach this based on what I've said. I think those on the left who support basic income make a fundamental mistake in that they don't take the considerations I've just put forward into account, but that they imagine there is some special magic quality to basic income that's going to make it exempt from the factors that would hold it back. And what they actually really imagine, I think, is that existing systems fail to meet people's needs because of some kind of design flaw. And that if only income support could be reorganized in a better way, it would meet people's needs. But that's not what's driving the process of making them inadequate. And that's what needs to be understood. Now, this is not to say that how a program is designed is unimportant. I'm simply suggesting that it is a secondary, very much a secondary consideration. But with regards to how basic income is designed, I think there's a whole array of mistakes that are made in the sense of false hopes and expectations, and a couple of very serious mistakes that are made in terms of ignoring or disregarding very considerable dangers that exist with doing things along the lines of a basic income. First of all, the first and overriding assumption that is made that is completely unwarranted in my view is just simply the assumption that basic income would be more adequate. There's just this belief that it's going to somehow meet people's needs in ways that existing programs don't, that it's going to be exempt from the rules, that something about it will make it better. People point here in Ontario to the pilot project that the last Liberal government ran for a period, which provided, no question, an income that was significantly greater than social assistance provides in Ontario. But to assume that a showpiece test that they ran for some 2,000 people provides the level of income that would kick in if a basic income system were introduced across the province is, I think, a completely unwarranted assumption. It's also suggested that basic income would be better because it would be universal. But only some people hope for ultimately a universal basic income, but no model that's being advanced or seriously considered anywhere is actually a universal program. It will be targeted. Only some people will qualify. And it's also suggested that it would be that the stigma that is attached to to existing systems would be reduced, and therefore it would be more popular and it would be harder for governments to cut it. I don't think that really holds up. First of all, if it were introduced, it would be attacked, and its adequacy would be targeted in exactly the same way as existing programs. But secondly, popularity, even if it existed, is not going to save it. Healthcare programs, public healthcare programs, have been under attack and faced massive austerity cutbacks, as vital and necessary and popular as they are. So that wouldn't protect basic income. It's also suggested that it would be an unconditional benefit. Well, in practice, it's not likely to be unconditional, but I agree that existing income support programs are bureaucratically intrusive, that they are infused with elements of moral policing, and these things do indeed need to be challenged. It's also suggested that that basic income is going to happen, and indeed is necessary, because it's going to save us from the workless future or the robot future. Elon Musk, the billionaire whose one-way trip to Mars has been unfortunately delayed, he's a very big supporter of this notion of basic income as the antidote to the robot future. First of all, the notion that we are on the threshold of all being replaced as workers is, I think, overstated, and the real situation is somewhat more nuanced than that. But having said that, I don't deny that technological displacement isn't a real issue. What I do question is that there is some magic solution to that is going to be found with basic income. That the Silicon Valley billionaires are going to set aside a portion of the bounty that their robots create for them and provide everybody they displace with an adequate income. That simply isn't how capitalism works. Since the Industrial Revolution, capitalists have used new machinery to gain a competitive edge over their rivals and to displace workers, to create a greater climate of desperation, and to try to drive down wages. And that's the fight that we're going to be in. There isn't going to be some magic social policy solution that's put in place, and it's certainly not going to come out of Elon Musk's pocket. We are going to have to fight in this situation. As workers have always fought against technological displacement. We're going to have to fight for reduced hours of work. We're going to have to take up a whole series of important struggles. But I think it needs to be said that only under this irrational and greedy profit-driven system is this an issue. The notion that technological gains, which in effect increase the productivity of human labor, should be something we should be alarmed about, is confined to this system. Why should not those productive gains be used to benefit everyone? What I'm rather suggesting is, why does Elon Musk get to keep his robots? Why don't we take them from him and use those technological gains to everybody's advantage? But even in the short term, he's not, and the Silicon Valley billionaires are not going to set aside a bounty to take care of the problem. We're going to have to fight issues of technological change as movements. I would also just mention the question of the pilot projects, because this is a big selling point for people who promote basic income. They say that in Ontario, they provided people, a small group of people, some 2,000 people, they provided that small population of people with an income that was better than they could get on social assistance, that was relatively secure until the Tories cut it, and that they did studies, intensive studies, to show that people were better off. Well, I don't think that's very surprising. I don't think it's very surprising that if you give a small group of people a bit more money, they're going to be a bit better off. I don't think the pilots prove anything. I think they don't prove anything because they're not studying basic income. They're studying poor people to get the predictable result that improved income makes people's health better, makes people's lives better. Of course it does. The question with basic income, however, is what effect it would have if it were introduced across a major jurisdiction in a major capitalist economy. Which brings us to the reasons why I think basic income takes us in very, very dangerous directions, directions we should actually be fighting rather than embracing. Fundamentally, what they are talking about doing with a basic income is massively extending the degree to which social provision is provided through the cash benefit. That's essentially the name of the game. 70% of the people on the pilot project in Ontario were not on social assistance. What they were looking at primarily was a wage top-up system. So the idea is to extend this benefit to wider swathes than ever of people who are working. That's basically the idea. And this commodification of social provision in this direction is enormously dangerous. What it creates is a situation where you've basically accepted the low-wage, precarious workforce, but you simply take away the worst effects of it, or try to profess to, by taking tax revenues that have been paid into by other working class people and providing not just a wage top up to those workers, but what is in effect a wage subsidy to low wage employers. And this, of course, removes pressure on those employers to increase wages. It undermines the effort to raise minimum wages. It simply accepts the low-wage precarious workforce, but tries to provide a kind of a limited sedative. A huge mistake in my view. I also believe that by providing so much more in the form of the cash benefit, you would facilitate the agenda of austerity and privatization. That the cash benefit would, in effect, would in practice be used as a replacement for, in the present context of an austerity and privatization agenda, would be used to further it, would be used to justify and facilitate the gutting of public services. And this, I think, is the thing that makes the right so enamored with the question of basic income. Now, I understand you can find many progressive people who support basic income. I'm not suggesting that it's purely something that the right has embraced, but there's a reason why the wealthiest human being on earth and one of the most exploitative people on the planet, Jeff Bezos, favors basic income. There's a reason why the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is advocating for a national Canada-wide pilot project of basic income to be organised. And there's a reason why Milton Friedman, the veritable ideological founding father of the neoliberal order, there's a reason why Milton Friedman was such an enthusiastic supporter of basic income. And you can find it in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, which I always keep by my bedside. Friedman argued simply that things like unions, minimum wages, social programs, they were all monstrous totalitarian interferences with the freedom of the marketplace. But like the founders of the poor laws in Elizabethan England, Friedman recognized that totally unfettered capitalism can be counterproductive. And so he advocated a meager payment to provide just enough for people to survive. Get rid of everything else, but provide that as a way of blunting the contradictions enough in other for him and his multi-millionaire and billionaire friends to enjoy their freedom. That was basically his idea. The right-wing US political scientist Charles Murray has developed it further, and he stresses this, as did the Canada's right-wing Fraser Institute, a blog they put out. What he argues is that you provide a bare, meager payment that is set low enough to ensure that the flow of low-wage workers is not interfered with, but just enough to prevent complete social breakdown. And then at the same time, you ensure that people receive. You ensure that this system doesn't augment or improve or bolster existing systems of social provision, that it replaces them. Murray is absolutely clear on that. It must replace everything that currently exists. All social programs, all public services must be rolled into this. And this is why the political right and so many powerful capitalists and so many of the institutions of global capitalism are enamored with basic income. That, and the not unimportant consideration that it offers a promise of jam tomorrow. As long as we can all be engaged in this extensive consideration of basic income, it directs attention away from the need to address things like the gross inadequacy of existing systems. So that, I think, is where basic income takes us in this society, especially. At this time, especially, with the present balance of forces in society, especially, that's where basic income is leading us. But of course, the counter you get from progressive-minded people who support basic income is simply to say, but that's not my vision. That's not the kind of basic income I want. I don't want it to replace everything else. I want other systems to be strengthened, in fact. I want good minimum wages. I don't want those things. Well, the problem with that perspective is it doesn't take into account the prevailing situation. It doesn't take into account the present balance of forces. It doesn't take into account the agenda of capitalism. It just assumes somehow that a wish will get you there. But it's not like an online shopping expedition. You don't pick out the version of basic income you want and somebody knocks on your door and delivers it. The kind of basic income that actually came into existence would be shaped by the prevailing situation. So if you go that route, and if you say, I'm just going to go with my vision, then you can dream up anything you like. You can have a basic income that includes a fountain of youth if you want to. You can dream up anything. Some people suggest that basic income could be provided to everyone at such an adequate level. Where it's going to come from exactly and who's going to provide it is not entirely clear. But it's going to provide such a level of adequate income to everybody that they can literally decide whether they want to participate in the job market or not. But as Pam Frake from Toronto's Workers' Action Centre put it so well, to expect the capitalist state to provide the working class with an unlimited strike fund is an absurdity. And to suggest that at this point at time, after 40 years of defeat at the hands of neoliberal attack, that we're in a position to win anything, if there's even a fraction of that, is preposterous. Somebody the other day told me that that my arguments were wrong because his version of basic income was that it must be universal, it must be adequate, and it must be financed entirely by a tax on wealth. Well, I mean, you can demand the sky rains whiskey, but it's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. Philippe Van Perige, the Belgian advocate of basic income, has even suggested that basic income could transform society, could abolish capitalism. He describes it as the capitalist road to communism. But if wishes were horses, then we could bet on basic income. However, we have to deal with reality. And at the moment, I think it constitutes a very dangerous and distracting left illusion that I'd like to do what I can to challenge with what I'm saying here today. The NDP sections of the NDP at least are putting very considerable effort behind trying to win a basic income. I'm sad to say some trade union leaders are buying into the idea. Social movements are backing it. Even a section of the anti-capitalist left is embracing basic income in this situation. It poses as something very radical. Sometimes it poses as a very transformative, radical, bold proposal, but actually I think it makes its peace with the capitalist marketplace and the neoliberal order. It says wages will remain low, but they'll be topped up out of the tax revenues. That's a huge mistake. That's an entirely wrong direction to go in. The alternative is to rejuvenate our unions and fight for decent wages, to fight to increase minimum wages, to fight for workers' rights, rather than extend the cash benefits and extend the reach of the marketplace. Far better to put considerable effort into the struggle for public services. Now, I fully acknowledge that there are income support programs that are vital and are needed, and we can't continue as a broad movement to let those things be a kind of a poor cousin. We need an unemployment insurance that provides adequate coverage and secure coverage. We need the disgusting attack on injured workers that has taken place to be reversed and decent benefits to be provided. We need a fight to ensure that disability benefits are adequate, meet people's needs, are secure. We need to challenge all of the intrusion and moral policing that goes on within these systems. Absolutely we do. But to extend the cash benefit widely out into the workforce, I think that's a huge mistake. And we could do so much better rather than try to get what would in practice be a very meager cash benefit. So much better to put our efforts into a struggle to challenge the commodification of housing, the neoliberal city, the the blighting of urban space with this agenda of greed, by fighting for a massive extension of social housing. So that's a benefit that comes to working class people and doesn't go into the pocket of landlords. There's a need to fight for increases in the adequacy of healthcare. The pandemic has made that absolutely clear. We need pharmacare, we need dentacare, we need a universal childcare program that isn't an empty perennial liberal promise, but that is a reality. We need post-secondary education to be free. We need free public transport systems. On all of these fronts, we need to take up a fight. And people will say, but we've suffered defeats. We can't win these things. And I admit, certainly, we are in a situation where we have been for a very long time forced on the defensive. The class struggle has not gone in our favour for some quite considerable time. But I'm afraid there isn't an alternative. There isn't an alternative but to rebuild and to fight back and to win what we can and to fight to challenge this society, but to fight for a different society. That's absolutely indispensable. There, in fact, isn't some social policy ruse that can just put things right. Basic income is not going to solve the problem. Our lack of strength, our lack of ability to fight in the way we need to fight is the problem we've got to address. And we need to build that movement now more than ever. In this situation of global crisis, more than ever, we need to fight back. And we can do so much better in focusing our struggles than to fight for the commodification of social provision and basic income. Thanks very much.